Ryan was bitter about her choice of places to have it, but he'd almost expected it. Her lack of respect, her contempt for him lately almost dictated she do something like that. He'd covered the master bedroom with 3 of his 12 cameras, and they caught all the action. Carrie and Sean's enthusiastic antics in that room were featured in the tape Ryan began compiling for his in-laws and friends. He also thought the bank, where Sean headed up a major department, would be interested in the videos Ryan had of a naked Sean working on his laptop in Ryan and Carrie's kitchen. Sean had plugged into the easily accessible phone jack beside the kitchen table. Ryan assumed, he thought it was a good bet that Sean had logged into the bank server and was pounding out a little work while he waited for his body to recover from the excesses he was placing on it with his subordinate. It was icing on the cake that, while resting between bouts, the adulterous couple also discussed both Sean's and Carrie's families and more than a few of the friends they had in common. Ryan planned to highlight these sections and distribute them to the family members and acquaintances who believed Carrie's lies about him. He looked forward to exposing the adulterous pair. He really did. He had everything he needed. It was just a matter of when. "Excuse me, sir." The cafe's hostess was surprised when Ryan didn't respond immediately. He was usually very alert. "I'm sorry," Ryan said. "I'm afraid I was drifting there for a bit." He blinked. The distasteful memories and musings had a powerful hold over him. It wasn't the first time he'd found it difficult to snap back to the real world. "Ah, no big thing, sugar," she replied. "Listen, honey, we're just about full up this morning, you know? And I was wondering if you would mind sharing your table with Connie and little Belinda here." Ryan looked around, seeing for the first time the little restaurant did indeed have every table occupied, but there were other tables with open seats. He was a little surprised the hostess was talking to him about accepting strangers at his booth, but then, it probably was the largest table available. He wasn't in the mood, but he saw no way out of it. His eyes fastened on the tall, attractive woman with long, jet black hair standing at the waitress's shoulder and the little girl beside her. In the space between one breath and the next, his mood changed. He was very glad the hostess had singled him out. Still not running on all cylinders, it took him a moment to respond. When he realized he was still sitting there like a bump on a log, he flushed and contorted his body to get up. "I apologize," he said to the trio. "I was brought up to be polite. I want you to know that. I really was, but sometimes I'm just not as quick on the uptake as I could be," he added. He reached out and patted the waitress on her forearm. I'd be happy if Connie and Belinda would join me," he said, thinking fast. He thought he remembered the names correctly. "Thank you," the little girl trilled. Her high, small child's voice was clear, her words easily understood. Ryan had been expecting the woman to reply. He'd been looking at her and not at the young child. He glanced down, but the youngster had already walked around him and had climbed onto the bench seat. "May I have my boozer seat, please?" she asked sweetly. She held out her hand, pointing behind him. Confused, Ryan looked around at the woman he guessed was the little girl's mother, and then saw the booster seat the waitress was holding out to him. "I'm so sorry," Ryan said contritely. He took the seat from the waitress and held it steady on the bench while the girl climbed in. "Thank you," she said, smiling up at him. Ryan stood back and was about to move over to the other side of the table when the youngster interrupted again. "I want my mom to sit over there," she demanded. She pointed at the opposite bench seat. "You sit here." The little girl was pointing at a position next to her own seat. Ryan looked up at the girl's mother, confused and more than a little apologetic. "She's so shy and unassuming, isn't she?" the woman asked in a soft contralto. Her lips parted in a wide grin. She gestured at him to go ahead and sit. "If it's all right with you, I don't mind," she added. The little girl's matching grin decided the issue for Ryan. "I'd be most happy to sit with you," he told the child with mock formality. He slid into the booth beside her. He could see the delight in her eyes and couldn't help but respond. It had been a long time since he'd felt welcome anywhere. "I'm Ryan," he said, introducing himself. "Connie, Consuela Robertson," the woman responded. "And that's Belinda, the terror of the Vargas preschool," she added, motioning toward the towhead youngster beside Ryan. "Mommy," Belinda protested, scandalized. "That's not nice." Ryan chuckled, completely enchanted by the woman and her daughter. The woman extended her hand and they shook. He liked the feel of her hand in his. It was slender, very feminine, but it had strength too. He looked up at her. "Do folks call you Connie or Consuela?" he asked matter-of-factly. She hesitated, giving him with a vaguely hooded look. "I like Consuela," she said, "but Connie is okay. Lots of people call me that," she added quickly. "Consuela is a beautiful name," Ryan replied. "It fits you better than Connie, I think. Is it okay if I call you Consuela?" he asked. He watched her for a reaction that didn't come for a long moment. He was beginning to think he'd made a bad mistake. "I think I would like that," she said quietly. The two matronly women in the booth behind Ryan stiffened slightly. They smiled knowingly at each other. Consuela had moved here just after her baby had been born, coming home after a bad marriage had ended in divorce. Little Belinda was 4.5 now. It was the first time anyone had seen any sign Consuela. Connie to some had shown any sign of enjoying a man's presence. The two women sneaked looks at the three when they got up to leave. No one in the booth noticed. Wednesday found Ryan waiting for Consuela and Belinda before he ordered breakfast. When they came through the door, Belinda shook free of her mother's hand and raced through the tables to him. Her last two steps included a little hop to launch herself into the air for him to catch her. "Linda!" her mother scolded when she caught up. "You know you're not supposed to do that." "It's okay, Mommy," the 4-year-old explained. "Mr. Ryan catched me." That settled it as far as she was concerned. She went on to another topic. "I'm going to sit on his lap today and eat breakfast," she announced. "Honey, I know he caught you, but what if he hadn't seen you coming or something? Besides, you don't even know if Mr. Ryan wants you to sit on his lap or eat breakfast with us." Belinda looked into Ryan's face for a quick instant and then turned back to her mother. "He does," Belinda said succinctly. There was no doubt in her voice. Ryan cleared his throat. "It's true, but to make it official," he said, "Ms. Robertson, would you and the charming Belinda care to join me to break your fast?" he said lightly. He and the woman shared a chuckle as they arranged themselves around the table they had this morning. Belinda did sit on his lap for a good part of the meal, sitting up to eat morsels from his plate or hers, and then lying back to rest contentedly against his chest. Toward the end of the meal, she got restless. When one of her playmates came in with her parents, Belinda scrambled down to go visit. It left Ryan and Consuela alone for the first time. Things were suddenly and unexpectedly awkward. Neither could find the proper opening. "You don't remember me, do you?" Consuela asked unexpectedly. Ryan cocked his head and looked closely at her. He studied her for a long moment. Her long, raven hair framed the finely molded features of her face. Her fair skin was flawless. She wore, and needed, only a small amount of makeup, only a little mascara on her eyelashes and lip gloss on her lips. Actually, her dark eyes didn't need anything more to bring out their loveliness. Her lips were full, and he'd already admitted it to himself, very inviting. He knew when he stood, the top of her head was right at his chin. She was probably 5 feet and maybe 6-7 inches tall. "Consuela," he said finally, "if I've seen you before, I'm reasonably sure I would remember it." "I'm not in the habit of forgetting beautiful women," he said with finality. None of his words gave any hint of anything but a serious answer to a serious question. Consuela colored slightly, both from his close examination of her before he spoke and the words he used. "Well, it was only twice, and both were very quick," she said. "At the bank where your wife works?" she prompted. "A long time ago. The girl next to me cashed a check for you once while your wife stood with you. That was before I got transferred to Mr. Michael's section. Then, Carrie waved at me another day when you were there, and you turned around to see who it was. Remember that? A year and 3 months, maybe year and a half ago?" Ryan shook his head. He tried to place the woman sitting across from him in the bank setting, but failed completely. "I'm sorry," he said. "If I was with Carrie, I probably was talking to her, or listening to her, or trying to or something," he said lamely. "So you do forget women on occasion, eh?" Consuela grinned to take away any sting in her words. "I had to have been badly distracted at the time," Ryan protested, chuckling at the same time. "If I was with Carrie, she would have been working hard to occupy all my attention back then anyway." "I know," Consuela said. She looked Ryan in the eyes for a bit. She thought she'd seen something when Carrie's name came up. "How is Carrie these days?" she asked suddenly. She nodded her head when a wall slammed down behind his eyes. "You know then," she said in a sympathetic tone. Ryan frowned. Consuela shrugged. I left there 2 months ago. Everyone at the bank, even all the customers who've seen them together, know what's going on." Ryan snorted softly and shook his head. His eyes were clouded and troubled. "They're not even trying to hide it, huh?" She shook her head. "They did for a while, but most of us could see what was happening. From what I hear from a couple of friends who are still working there, it's gotten more and more obvious," Ryan suggested. "Worse. Brazen was the word I was going to use," Consuela replied. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Everyone down there thinks Mr. Michaels is a real ass. No one knows what Carrie sees in him." "Yeah, I'm sorry too," Ryan said quietly. "I've suspected it for about 3 months, and I've been collecting proof for the past couple of weeks," he told her. "I think I have enough now to hang the both of them," he added. Consuela looked at him in surprise. "An interesting choice of words," she said finally. Ryan could see an excitement building quietly. Her eyes were bright. She was breathing quicker. She glanced quickly around to check on Belinda. I didn't leave my job in San Antonio exactly the way I implied I did," she said finally. "I left because I filed a harassment complaint against Shawn Michaels, and it went up all the way to the main headquarters in Chicago," she said. Ryan waited. He'd been waiting since Monday for Consuela to open up. He'd known there was something. After a while, a few months, the complaint came back down. The Chicago office said the complaint had not been substantiated and they couldn't act on it. Consuela's face flushed with anger at the memory. Her dark eyes flashed lightning. "After that, I got a couple of bad performance reports. 3 times. The accounts I was handling had minor and very temporary balancing problems, and they wrote me up," she said bitterly. "A little research, and they all came into balance, but that didn't seem to matter. They didn't do anything to anyone else for differences that had to be researched. But of course, me, they slam." Consuela shifted in her seat for a long moment, fuming at the way she'd been treated. It had humiliated and infuriated her at the same time. Ryan nodded encouragingly to get her to continue. "They shifted me over to the investment banking division for a while, but a woman came back from her maternity leave and all of a sudden, there was no slot for me. After a while, they made it clear I would have to go back to working as a window teller. Not only that, I would be working every weekend, and I was going to be moved eventually to a special late shift they were setting up so they could advertise the drive-thru was open late. They knew I had a young daughter, and there was no way I could take those hours." Consuela's voice was strained. She was frustrated and mad. She looked around and forced a smile when she caught Belinda's eye, and the little girl waved. "They let me go easy, I guess," Consuela continued. "I'll give them that. Nothing was ever said, but it was plain I could quit, and they'd give me good references. If I stayed, I'd see my daughter so seldom she'd forget what I looked like, and if I pushed the complaint, I'd be blacklisted and never work in a bank again." She was breathing deeply. She couldn't sit still. Her fingers twisted and twined about themselves in her lap. Consuela's pain and anger were ghosts sitting at the table with them. They joined the ones Ryan brought in every morning with him. All of them were so real they could have reached out and touched them. Consuela shut her eyes tightly, willing herself to be calm. It took a while, but the trembling slowly eased. Her face relaxed. Her shoulders slumped. "Hi, Mommy." The little voice came as a shock. Neither of them had noticed Belinda coming back to the table. "Mommy?" Belinda asked worriedly. "Are you crying?" Consuela's eyes had snapped open at Belinda's first words. Now she leaned down and opened them wide to show her daughter there were no tears. She forced a gentle smile onto her lips. "No, honey," Consuela said. "I just had them closed to think a little bit," she explained. Belinda looked doubtful, but she let it pass. "Tasha and her mom and daddy are eating, so I came back," she told her mother. "And I'm glad you did," Ryan exclaimed. He swept the little girl up in his arms and pulled her onto his lap. "Now," he said, "I'm still not quite sure where it is that you're ticklish." Belinda began squirming on his lap, already anticipating being tickled. Her tiny hands flew up to her neck to protect the sensitive flesh there. Ryan's hands darted to her ribs and tickled the small child for a few seconds. When Belinda dropped her hands, He shifted to her neck and Belinda shrieked. "Linda!" Consuela said quickly. "You can't." "It was my fault," Ryan interjected. "I know better, don't I, Belinda? Give me a hug and I'll quit," he told the little girl. She didn't want him to stop, but she knew what she was supposed to do. She wrapped her arms around Ryan's neck and hugged tightly. "I have a confession to make," Consuela announced. The noise from the children racing through the large plastic tubes overhead was almost deafening. She had to lean close to Ryan to make herself heard without shouting. Ryan had suggested the McDonald's out by the interstate after asking them to dinner. He'd known Belinda would love the playroom. She'd barely been able to sit still long enough to eat her 3 chicken nuggets and a couple of French fries. This was the first time Ryan had seen the mother and daughter except over breakfast, and also the first time they'd been together twice in the same day. Wednesday was turning out to be a day of firsts. Ryan looked at Consuela for a bit, digesting what she'd said. "You've been wanting to tell me about Carrie and also about your harassment complaint since Monday?" he guessed. Consuela's eyes widened and then narrowed again. "You knew?" she asked in a tight voice. He could tell it wouldn't take much to light up a temper that was easily sparked anyway. He'd only known her 3 days, and he knew that much about her already. To save himself, he shook his head. "I knew there was a reason Trish sat you at my table," he said carefully. Trish was the head waitress and hostess at the cafe who'd taken Ryan under her wing at the cafe. Trish had taken the time to talk with Consuela and Ryan for a long while when they paid their breakfast bill this morning. It had been a nice exchange. "I hoped it was because of my masculine beauty at first, but then I got a look at myself in the mirror," he said. His tone was light and cheerful. "That left only that you'd asked her to put you with me because you wanted to talk to me about something or wanted something from me. Once I eliminated a couple of less savory possibilities. They just didn't fit who you are," he said quietly. "I figured you'd get around to it sooner or later, and in the meantime, I was having more fun with you and Belinda than I've had in so long I can't remember the last time." The woman flushed faintly. It looked good on her. "That's part of it. I guess I should have just come out and told you when I recognized you Monday," she mumbled. She tried to get mad because Ryan had guessed she had a reason for seeking him out the last couple of days, but it wasn't happening. He was so disarming with his candor, she couldn't summon even a tiny kernel of anger. "I didn't mind," Ryan assured her. "I enjoyed your company. I already told you I did." He looked at her speculatively. "What is it you think I can do for you?" he asked. Consuela took a deep breath. "Well, we didn't get to everything this morning. I don't just have a harassment complaint anymore. I have a suit I filed in federal court 3 weeks ago. I was hoping I could get you to testify to the fact that Shawn Michaels is having an affair with your wife," she said. "My attorney doesn't know about you yet, but she's told me in the past if we could show Mr. Michaels has continued to do the things he tried to do with me, we have a chance to." She threw her hands up in the air, giving up the explanation. She looked at Ryan for a moment. "Me too," she added diffidently. Ryan's eyes scanned hers. A blank, confused look came over his face while he wondered what he'd missed. Me and Belinda have enjoyed having breakfast with you too," Consuela offered by way of explanation. Ryan's features cleared and he smiled. "I'm glad," he said quietly. There was a small silence. "If it will help for me to tell what I know about the affair, sure," he said, returning to the original conversation. "I'm not up on lawyer things, but I'll testify to anything I can," he told her. "You know for sure?" Consuela said in a low, intense voice. "You can say you know Michaels is, that he's actually having it with my wife?" Ryan asked. Consuela nodded, too embarrassed to speak. "Oh, yeah, I can testify to that," Ryan assured her. Consuela sat quietly, her eyes holding his. Hers were filled with a sudden sympathy. "Maybe not," she said hesitantly. "Maybe you shouldn't. It might not be a good thing. There'd be questions and—" Ryan smiled. It was the predatory smile of a shark nosing in for the kill. "Consuela, my marriage is over. Our vows were broken before they've been shattered now. My marriage was over the minute she began a relationship with Shawn Michaels. I've been collecting evidence to show a court to prove her infidelity. I'm going public with it to show God and everybody what she's done, what she's doing. I'm getting a divorce from Carrie to make everything official, but it's been over for a long time. I've spent the last few months watching her, and letting her burn the love I used to have for her out of my soul. I don't care for her now, and nothing can embarrass or humiliate me any more than she already has. I'm going to lower the boom on her and her friend, and I'm going to do it hard." Consuela looked at Ryan, seeing something in him she'd not noticed before. His blue eyes had gone an icy shade of blue as his anger built. She believed him. He was going to make a believer of Shawn Michaels too. She smiled slowly. "It takes a lot of strength to do what you're going to do, Ryan. I think you are one hombre Mr. Michaels should never have messed with," she said softly. Ryan was startled at the comment. It broke his concentration and his rage ebbed away. He smiled at the beautiful woman sharing his table. As he looked, her face changed. "You have proof, you said?" she demanded. "You have pictures or something?" Ryan nodded. "I've got videotape of them together, tape recordings of cell phone conversations, and other tapes of her talking to girlfriends in her car about her lover. Heck, I got a bunch of things," Ryan told her. "I know the cell phone conversations can't be used for much, maybe not the tapes from the recorder I put under her car seat, unless she gets on the stand and denies the conversations ever took place. Then they can be used to impeach her. I'll bet." "The videos?" "Well, the videos I have of her hugging and kissing that a hole inside the bank, on the city streets, and I've got them walking arm in arm with him into our house, those can be used. I'm almost certain the ones of her and Doofus in our bed are legal too. I think I have a perfect right to videotape things that go on inside my house. They're pretty graphic, as they say." "Oh, wow," Consuela whispered. "Oh goodness, I'm sorry. It's so sad you had to see things like that, but you've got her good, don't you?" Ryan chuckled. "Oh, yeah," he said, drawing out the last word to emphasize his satisfaction. "Got him too," he added. "I haven't seen a lawyer yet, but I have my own suit to file, you know. I reread Carrie's contract, and there's a morals clause right there in big black letters on the second page. It's not even in the fine print. I don't see how there would not be a clause just like that in Michael's contract too. That should mean the bank is liable if they don't enforce their own rules and regulations, right?" Ryan thought for a moment. Like I said, I don't do lawyer stuff, but I think we can help each other out on these things. You can testify in my civil suit that, what do they call it? Something about establishing a pattern of conduct or something like that. And how about not taking action to stop it? What are the legal words for saying that, I wonder?" He grinned and made a mental note to call a lawyer and run these things by him or her. For the first time in a while, he saw a way he might be able to keep his little contractor firm afloat after his wife took her pound of flesh in the divorce proceedings. Texas family law was structured so that property settlements were affected by such things as adultery on the part of one of the spouses. He'd already been counting on that, and now there was an even better chance of getting enough cash from a settlement to buy out whatever percentage Carrie's share of the business was. Thursday was a disappointing day in the cafe. Ryan was there, as the locals had come to expect, but Consuela was not. It was because, as Ryan knew, Consuela had to go in early to open up the small town bank where she was the assistant manager. The crowd of regulars thought it was sad he was sitting alone, but they really should have noticed he'd brought a book to read while he waited for his omelet. He wouldn't have done that if he'd thought he'd have company for breakfast. The book was a Western by Louis L'Amour. Ryan loved Westerns. They were about a day when a man could make a place for himself through sheer force of will, courage, and an attitude of being unwilling to accept a slight at the hands of another. It worked for L'Amour's heroes again and again. In this novel, one of the minor players was a young married woman who had taken a lover, a bad man who was good with a gun. Her farm boy husband had tried to use his gun on the bad man, but he'd had no chance. The simple farmer died a painful death when the wife's lover shot him. Ryan identified with the farm boy. Regardless of the consequences, he'd taken up an unfamiliar tool, a pistol, to defend the marriage and his personal honor. It hadn't been smart, but Ryan could see where the man hadn't been willing to live with the alternative. Ryan understood the man. He understood him well. The omelet was especially good that morning. Trish had given the high sign to the cook to include extra amounts of the mushrooms and sausage that Ryan especially liked. He was being given privileges some long-term regulars still didn't get. A few people noticed the fat omelet and knew the head waitress and hostess had given Ryan her seal of approval. At her suggestion, Ryan and Consuela met Thursday night at a Golden Corral restaurant a little further out of San Antonio. The chances of contact with anyone they knew were slim. They'd agreed this was better than being seen together. After all, he was still a married man, and people wouldn't understand they were planning 2 lawsuits against a multinational banking institution, its regional headquarters in San Antonio, and a number of its senior officers. Ryan commented on the fact that Consuela asked questions and talked while waving her fork around like a symphony conductor's baton. It was her Latina heritage, she said. Her grandmother had been raised in a small village in the south of Mexico. She needed her hands in order to speak properly. Ryan teased her, saying if her hands were tied behind her, it would be the same as putting a gag in her mouth. She thought about it for a moment, then stuck out her tongue at him. He laughed out loud. He couldn't remember when he'd last done that. She was surprised, in turn, by the fact that his great-grandfather had been a full-blood member of the Comanche Nation. She studied his face closely, remarking the only contribution she saw from that side of the family that she saw was his high cheekbones. His blue eyes and blonde hair certainly came from somewhere else. They'd ended by deciding contributions from the Scots, and the Irish overwhelmed most of the genes in both their ancestries. Consuela asked if Ryan knew there were more than a few Irish dance schools around San Antonio. Did he know they held an annual phase, a contest, in one of the downtown hotels? Ryan did not. Consuela told him he should go next October. He said he would if she would go with him. She said she would. There was a pause while they both paid attention to their plates. Will the videos and stuff be admissible in court, even in divorce court? She asked finally. Ryan shrugged. I'm sure a good lawyer will find a way to get them introduced somehow, he replied after a while. If not, I'll make copies of the DVDs and mail them to her family and all our friends as Christmas presents, he added with a grin. I thought you said you had videotapes, Consuela remarked idly, after finishing a bite of Caesar salad. I do, Ryan replied. But I bought a really fast computer a couple months ago for the office, and I loaded a program on it to convert movies from a digital camera to a DVD format. He saw her confusion. Oh, first I had to play the VHS tapes and record from the VCR to my digital camcorder, he explained. Sounds like a lot of work, she commented. Yeah, not a very elegant solution, he replied. But I'm doing all this spy work on a shoestring, and I didn't want to get advice from anyone, considering the subject matter. I had to find a few workarounds. I think you did very well, Consuela said quickly. You've got a lot more proof for what you want to do than I have, she added. Ryan took a moment to absorb what she'd said. It felt good to be complimented for something he'd done instead of having faults pointed out, as Carrie invariably did these days. Well, he said after swallowing a chunk of rare steak doused in A1. I think I can do some things for yours in my case. I've got a couple of shots of the dork sitting at our kitchen table, naked as the day he was born, but working on something on his laptop. No, Consuela exclaimed. Really? She flushed faintly as her delight fought with embarrassment at the mental picture Ryan's words built. Oh yeah, Ryan replied, signing onto a network, logging into a server it looked like, and then doing some transactions. What is it he does anyway? Oh, he runs the division that does high-end personal wealth management, she said. He manages accounts for the very, very rich customers, makes investments for them if they've authorized him to, keeps track of trusts, sends transfers to other banks if they ask him to, stuff like that. Ryan nodded, his brow furrowed. Transfers? Wire transfers, she explained after a sip of iced tea. Like, Western Union, say? Oh yeah, kinda sorta, but on a much bigger scale, she explained. Millions of dollars are sent and received every day. I see, he replied. They trust him with that, huh? He said speculatively. He laughed. If they could see him trying to enter his password 3 times and screaming like a spoiled child at his laptop when it won't take, I'm not so sure they trust him very much at all. He laughed again. He might send a rich guy's money off to Timbuktu or something instead of Tucumcari. He's really not very good at doing computer stuff. Consuela laughed with him. Putting in his password 3 times, huh? You saw him do that? Yeah, once he tried again and again, and it never did process, Ryan remarked. Carrie came downstairs once, naked as he was, anyway, she input his password for him. That's a no-no. I'll bet the bank won't want anyone to see. He thought for a moment. I have a feeling all of a sudden, I won't have to go to court at all, and maybe not you either, he said. The people down at the bank are not going to want any publicity on this. When I tell them what I have, they're going to fall all over themselves trying to get me and you to settle out of court. How about that? You might just be right, Consuela agreed. You can see him entering the keystrokes and Carrie knows his password too? She asked idly. Sure do, Ryan replied. Consuela snorted her contempt. The idiot, she said contemptuously. I had a security level that only allowed me to do small-time stuff. His access level lets him work on all the accounts and do all kinds of magic with them, she said. Only a fool allows someone else to know their password, she added. The other person might be as honest as the day is long, but… She shrugged her shoulders expressively. Yeah, that's a fact, Ryan agreed. Good thing Carrie hasn't used what she knows, Consuela said after another swallow. She could ruin him if she did. Yeah, I guess she could, Ryan said. He thought for a while. Actually, so could I, he said thoughtfully. 'Cause I know his password too, you know. I watched him type it often enough. Darn good thing you're an honest man, Consuela remarked with a quick grin. Ryan shook his head. Huh, he shouldn't count on that too much, he said. I don't like him one damn bit or her, he added. They laughed. You like Louis L'Amour? She asked. Ryan had brought the book inside to read while he waited for her to arrive. She'd said she might be late. Oh yeah, Ryan said quickly. He and Tom Clancy are my favorite writers. Both of them are natural storytellers. Uh-huh, she answered. I like Tom Clancy. What's Louis L'Amour about? They talked for another hour. They had to tip the waitress well. She cheerfully let them sit unmolested, except for refilling their iced tea glasses when they lingered a long while after eating as much as they could. On her way home, Consuela Robertson ran over the conversations she'd had with Ryan Gilchrist this evening. It was more than enjoyable to be in the company of a good-looking man after so long. It took her years to get over her divorce. She hadn't trusted men in general for a long time, but she did this one. He listened to her, and he was big, very strong, she thought. But he was incredibly gentle with Belinda. He didn't think he was handsome at all. He'd said something about it last night, but he was. He spoke so well too. He didn't seem to need to rush to contradict her, to correct things she said he thought were wrong. It was good to be with him. Her thoughts were all over the place as she pulled into the gravel driveway. She sat in the car for a long moment with the lights off. It was a thing she learned to do while living in Albuquerque when she first got married. Their house had been right at the edge of one gang's territory and too close to another. The sounds of shooting could be heard most weekends. She learned to look into the shadows before getting out of vehicles. It was necessary to see who was there before exposing oneself. There was no one in the shadows here. She knew there was some gang violence in San Antonio, but it hadn't spread out this far yet. It wasn't a very pretty neighborhood, but her neighbors were all retired folks or hard workers at a variety of jobs in the area. She sighed. Sometimes she thought this neighborhood was a metaphor for her life. She was nearing 30 years of age. Time was passing her by just as it was the houses on her block. The houses were a little run down, in need of some care, and the atmosphere was a little desperate because that care was slow in coming. Some of her neighbors had already given up. She rolled her shoulders and shook her head to shake off the mood. She got out of her 9-year-old Mercury and trudged next door to Mrs. Alvarez to pick up Belinda. A little while later, as she was getting her little girl into pajamas and her teeth brushed, Consuela found herself staring into space. A thought had occurred to her, a plan that blossomed and matured in the space between two heartbeats. There was a way to get some payback. The trouble was, what would Ryan think of her idea? What would he think of her? His opinion meant more to her than she'd realized until just this moment. You want to look at the DVDs? Ryan asked. He was confused. It was Friday night, a night for partying. But that wasn't Consuela's way, what he knew of her anyway. And there was the baby in the bedroom just a few steps away. Belinda had been sent to bed, but she hadn't gone willingly. She hadn't wanted to go to sleep at all with Ryan there. It had been the first time Ryan had been invited here. Belinda had climbed into Ryan's lap when he got there and had resisted every attempt Consuela made to get her to leave Ryan alone for even a moment. Ryan hadn't cooperated with Consuela's efforts very much. The little 4-year-old was making a deep impression on him. Lady, those aren't for casual viewing, you know? It's a lot of S and talking about it, and them disrespecting everyone in their little world. They just not. I know, Consuela exclaimed. She was fighting to keep the redness visible in the hollow of her throat from spreading. Ryan studied her briefly, then grinned. On second thought, none of the videos are really good pee. Most of them are pretty boring, actually. If you want to watch them, I guess it's okay with me. He was teasing. He didn't think she really wanted to watch the S. There was another reason he hadn't figured out yet. He watched as the red spread from her neck to her ears. No, she protested. She searched for the words she needed. She tried again. Look, Ryan, remember we talked about the book you had with you last night, right? Ryan pursed his lips. He still didn't see where this was going. Yeah. Consuela wet her lips with the tip of a pink tongue. The sight caught Ryan's attention and nearly distracted him from what she said next. You said you understood why that farmer boy tried to kill his wife's lover, right? She asked. And you told me you don't know how you did not kill your wife's first lover, didn't you tell me that just last night? And you had to quit carrying your gun because you were afraid of what you'd do about Shawn Michaels if you ran into him, or something? Ryan nodded. Their conversations had traveled pretty far afield last night. He told Consuela many things he'd never told anyone else. Consuela got up to pace. Her house was small. There were only 3 steps from couch to TV. Her pacing was quick and nervous. There is a way to make this cabron a lot more miserable than just losing his job, she said. Ryan grinned in astonishment. She'd said the word cabron with considerable fierceness. The word's literal translation from Spanish was a male goat. In slang, though, it meant something more like a whole FB. It was not used lightly by a woman as well-bred as Consuela was. It was an indication of how furious she was at the man. He took a moment to consider his alternatives while she continued to walk up and down the living room. Consuela was concerned only with getting some retribution from Mr. Shawn Michaels. She was incensed at Michaels' request 6 months ago that she meet him for S in an apartment he maintained close to the downtown bank. He hadn't accepted no for an answer and had badgered her for weeks before trying to get her fired. Ryan, on the other hand, was more furious at his wife's betrayal than he was at the man she'd done it with. That was not to say there wasn't enough rage left over for Michaels, though. Carrie had not bothered to take off her wedding band to F. Michaels. It had been clearly visible in all of the videotapes Ryan had of the pair of adulterous lovers. Even had he not known Ryan, and they had met on several occasions, Shawn Michaels had known quite well he was having it with another man's wife. In another day, in the days of Ryan's great-grandfather, twice removed, for instance, Ryan would have been completely justified in hunting Michaels down and shooting him where he stood. Abruptly, the scenario in the Louis L'Amour book he'd read came to mind. Ryan had always considered himself a throwback to an earlier time. He could do with a little payback directed against the man who had dishonored him. He grinned fiercely. What did you have in mind? He asked. So what do you think? Consuela asked nervously. She sat perched on the edge of the sofa cushion. Consuela looked at Ryan uneasily. She didn't know how he would feel about her idea. It was, after all, dangerous and highly illegal. It was Ryan's turn to pace up and down for a long while. He was a reasonably honest man. He wasn't a fanatic about it, though. If nothing else, his contacts with the local union when his little company had gone over 35 employees taught him there was a little avarice in everyone. The payments to the non-existent security firm he'd been making to avoid labor problems were illegitimate. He didn't want the union in his shop, and they were willing to look the other way for a consideration. He didn't know if it was against the law to pay the extortion, but it was certainly unlawful for the union rep to ask for it. Ryan had cooperated to the extent that he had never complained to the authorities. This was way beyond that minor involvement with something illegal. Could he live with this? It's risky, he said finally, awfully risky. He sat on the opposite side of the sofa and leaned his head back and closed his eyes to think. But not too risky if we're smart, he said at length. And if we don't get too greedy, he added. He thought a moment longer. How would we set up accounts to send wire transfers to? He asked. Consuela gulped and didn't answer for a moment. The comment and the follow-up question indicated Ryan had more than half accepted the premise of punishing the bank, Shawn Michaels, and Carrie Gilchrist all at one time. My mother's uncle Roberto lives in Mexico City, she said unsteadily. He has an import and export company, and he travels all over the Caribbean on business. He knows lots of people. Some of them have contacts. Her voice trailed off. Neither commented on the implication her great-uncle knew people in both high and low places, people he could call on who knew how to keep their mouths shut for a price, of course. We know the passwords, he mused, but no one knows we do. Actually, no one could reasonably expect there would be any way in the world we could know. He thought for a moment. Well, unless my video is shown somewhere, he remarked. He opened his eyes and looked at Consuela. This had better be worth me losing my revenge on my wife, he told her quietly. Why? She asked, confused at the comment. You can still show the times when she was having it with that man. It's just the kitchen that you couldn't show anyone. She stopped. Ryan was shaking his head. Nope. We can't afford the possibility someone might wonder if I had spy cameras in one place. Why wouldn't I have cameras somewhere else? See? She nodded. It made too much sense to be debated. Ryan closed his eyes again and tilted his head to rest on the back of the sofa. I paid cash for the cameras and everything else, he said reflectively. That's all they would accept. The guy was moving, liquidating a lot of merchandise, and needed cash quick. There were no credit card receipts with Ryan's name on them. Heck, it was up in Dallas more than a year ago. There's no paper trail at all, really. They gave me a cash receipt, but I know where it is. I can burn it, and then there is nothing. He probably has a cash register record of the purchase, but it's not linked to my name. Hell, he didn't ask my name, and I didn't give it. He doesn't know me from Adam and couldn't identify me at this late date if the cops do find him and talk to him. There's no problem there. We can destroy the VHS tapes, the DVDs, the tape recordings, the cameras, tape decks, everything. All the equipment is one place in my garage, and all the evidence I got with it is with me, out in my pickup, he said. He was talking to the ceiling. Think of all the details. We can get rid of all of it some way after wiping my prints off, of course. I didn't drill any holes in the wall to mount the cameras or anything, he mused. They were all just laying around hidden in places I knew Carrie wouldn't look. He snorted. Susie homemaker she is not. What else? Am I missing anything? They talked for hours, finally winding down in the early hours of Saturday morning. Most of the discussion had involved how to dispose of all the gear and the mountain of evidence he had gathered on his wife. It was hard letting that go, but there could be no hint Ryan had any idea of what was going on, much less that he had done some personal investigating. If that was known, there might be questions about what he'd seen during those investigations. That was a long shot, but there was no sense taking the chance. Consuela had wondered how she would get access to Michael's laptop, but Ryan knew the answer to that already. Michaels and Carrie were in a hurry when they came in the house for their trysts. The laptop was always parked quickly on the sofa while the two adulterers rushed upstairs. It rested there until the first time one of them came downstairs. He also knew how he could get himself and Consuela to the Gilchrist house without anyone upstairs knowing. There was a large swath of undeveloped land behind the house choked with scrub oak, some scruffy cedar, and lots of underbrush. Ryan had investigated it to some extent when they first moved into the new home. He knew how to work his way through from a street on the other side of the undeveloped land and right to their backyard. It was only a couple of 100 yards, 5, maybe 10 minutes, tops. Once there, the chain-link fence around the backyard could be negotiated by anyone in reasonably good shape. He and Consuela were in excellent physical condition. It would be no problem for them to jump the fence. At the house, the patio door rolled open and shut easily. It was silent for all practical purposes. He could leave it unlocked when he went to work. He'd make sure he left after Carrie, and he was willing to bet Carrie would never check it when she came home with her lover. The patio door opened into the dining room, and it was only a few steps into the kitchen where the phone jack was. The sofa in the living room where the laptop would be sitting was just beyond the dining room through a double-wide doorway. Extricating themselves would be a simple matter of retracing their steps. They didn't know how long Consuela would have on the laptop. They'd made a note to themselves to use a stopwatch on the VHS tapes to figure out how long the breaks were that Michaels and Carrie took between couplings. They'd been thinking the amount of transfers Consuela could make would be limited by the time they had on the day they pulled this off. It had finally occurred to them they could do this several times. Admittedly, it would have to be over a short time frame, say a week, but that should be more than enough to drain enough funds from the bank for it to hurt. Ryan had a fair idea Carrie would jump at the chance to invite her lover over if she thought Ryan was out of town. As a matter of fact, she had probably been doing Sean every day this week while he was gone. He'd know when he went home tomorrow. There'd be more videotapes to review because he'd left the all cameras and recording equipment in place. They broke for the night, too tired to make more plans. Before they parted, they agreed once they started this operation, they would never again make notes on paper or on a computer. The ones they had already taken to remind themselves of things they needed to investigate further, and other notes they'd make when there was no alternative, would be strictly controlled. When their use was over, they'd be burned and the ashes disposed of somewhere safe. They'd never make phone calls from phone numbers that could be traced back to either of them. They could never speak to anyone else about this, and most importantly, there was no way they could ever be seen in public together until this was over. The last agreement hurt the most. They'd become comfortable with each other even though they'd only known each other for 5 days. It hurt to realize they couldn't afford to attract attention by being seen together. Ryan went back to his motel and Consuela went to bed after checking on Belinda. The little girl would be sad when she woke and saw Ryan was not there. When he got home Saturday afternoon, Ryan found more proof of Carrie's infidelity waiting for him. He wouldn't have bothered watching it, except he needed to time the gaps between the bouts the two engaged in. He wasn't interested in an average or a maximum period he and Consuela would have. It was the minimum amount of time they would plan for. His review of the tapes showed they'd have a little more than 25 minutes each time for Consuela to do her magic. The interludes Carrie and Sean engaged in were never less than 30 minutes, and there was only one time it was that short. Ryan figured if he and Consuela were in the house only 25 minutes, there was no way they'd ever be caught. They had a 5-minute margin. In the garage, he dumped all the tapes into a cardboard box, along with most of the cameras, recorders, the audio tapes, and recorders. The box went into the passenger side floorboard in his pickup. It had been a year and more since Carrie had been near the truck, so it was a safe hiding place for virtually anything. Sunday afternoon, he drove to Austin and purchased half a dozen prepaid cell phones. Ryan and Consuela would use them to contact each other while they were avoiding each other for public consumption. They were untraceable, and he paid cash for them at 6 different convenience stores to ensure the purchases were also untraceable. Pilfering the accounts of super-rich bank customers was designed to create the appearance Shawn Michaels and Carrie Gilchrist had conspired in bank fraud. The jail terms they would get were in lieu of being shot the way they would have been 100 years earlier in this same city. Ryan and Consuela reasoned the money looted from the rich bank account holders would be replaced by the bank. The bank couldn't afford to lose their business if all the rich customers threatened to take all their funds out, and those people could be relied upon to make exactly that threat. The loss to the bank would be a further penalty they'd just have to absorb. Next time, they'd make sure one of their senior supervisors didn't harass a single mother or help himself to another man's wife on company time. Consuela's older second cousin, Richard, would store the laptop for them when she and Ryan finished the active phase of their plan. Richard was not computer literate and would have no interest in the laptop. He was also a recluse who had no friends. Actually, he associated with very few of the members of his own family. He lived in a cabin with no conveniences back off behind a mesa, and so far out in the sticks, even the ranch's cowboys never came there. He'd built there with the owner's permission and compensation for a favor Richard had done him 20 years earlier. No one knew quite what it had been. The only thing about Richard's living arrangements that interested Consuela and Ryan was that his home was extraordinarily remote, and no one could get near the place without Richard seeing them coming for a long way. No one visited Richard without very carefully identifying themselves at the edge of the parcel of land he considered his. He'd been known to take a shot at interlopers to get them moving along. The laptop was safe with him. Consuela was sure of it, and she'd easily convinced Ryan. A month and a half after Ryan and Consuela first met, all of the groundwork had been laid. The accounts were ready. The first pair of non-traceable cell phones they'd used to communicate with each other so far had been smashed, and the component parts scattered in a half-dozen San Antonio dumpsters. All the gear Ryan had purchased from the spy shop and the recordings he'd made with that equipment had all been destroyed, burned, and the remnants deposited a city dump 100 miles away. All their written notes had been burned, and the ashes dumped in the San Antonio River south of town. The storage bin in the garage where he'd kept the books had already been emptied, and the contents carefully disposed of. He hadn't wanted that area in the garage to stand out, so he cleaned the whole thing thoroughly, using copious amounts of cleaning fluids and lots of elbow grease. They were as ready as they could make themselves. Their plan called for Ryan to stay home for a week or two to interfere with the lovers' trysts. He took off from work, telling Carrie he needed the time to recharge and rest after several months of hard work. She could hardly object. There was no good reason to shove him out of the house. Ryan was exceptionally attentive all week long, showing up several times at the bank to take her to lunch or just dropping by in the middle of the afternoon to show her a purchase, ask her advice on something, or just to chat for a moment on her break. On Friday evening, he and Carrie attended a dinner hosted by one of the bank vice presidents at one of the posh hotels down on the Riverwalk. It was an excuse for a formal evening out in the early fall to fill in the gap after Labor Day and before the traditional holidays. Ryan hadn't gone to the one last year. He didn't like many of the people Carrie worked with, and he surprised Carrie this year with his enthusiasm about attending. She tried once or twice to dissuade him, but Ryan wouldn't hear of it. He surprised her again when she saw the beautifully tailored tux he bought just for this event, along with the best accessories he could find. A visit to the barber that afternoon had corralled his unruly hair, and he'd taken extraordinary care with his shave. She noticed his well-manicured nails and commented on them. In his line of work, keeping one's nails long enough to manicure was difficult. At the dance, Ryan stayed near his wife, though she tried a few times to divert him to other groups of partygoers. He smiled inwardly when she introduced Shawn Michaels to him again. Ryan already knew who he was from previous meetings, if nothing else, but it was interesting to look down into the man's eyes and squeeze his pale hand when Carrie took him over to Shawn and his cronies. The slightly widened pupils and the distinct expression of pain when Ryan's grip began to tighten were well worth the price of the tuxedo. Ryan hadn't realized until now that his 6 feet, 1 inch frame was so much taller than Mr. Michaels. He could tell Michaels didn't like it, and Carrie didn't seem to appreciate the clear distinction between the two men either. Ryan wandered away from Carrie's side not long after that, but he wasn't alone for long. A number of women, unattached and otherwise, had noticed the byplay when Ryan shook Michael's hand and wanted a closer look at the winner of the contest. He noticed a look of irritation on Carrie's face when she saw him across the room with 3 women vying for the attention of her tall, strong husband. Carrie grew visibly more concerned when Ryan reintroduced himself to Sharon Michaels, Shawn's wife. He'd met her earlier in the year at one of the regular functions, but hadn't seen her since. The attractive blonde spent a half-hour chatting casually with Ryan. Near the end of their conversation, Sharon was distracted by something behind Ryan. He turned to see Carrie standing close to Shawn and smiling up into his face. They were part of a crowd. There was nothing overtly suspicious about their postures or attitude, but Sharon was watching closely. When he turned back to Sharon, a ghost of a frown was just fading from her face. There was a sadness in her eyes she couldn't hide. Ryan didn't know what to do. He didn't know her well enough to say anything about what he knew. He wasn't sure how she'd take it, and now was not the right place or time to chance it. All of the contrived interest in being with Carrie, Ryan thought of it as a smokescreen and bait for a trap slowed in the second week. It had served its purpose. Carrie and Michaels were so spooked, they didn't even try to arrange a rendezvous for fear Ryan would show up somewhere unexpectedly. Ryan did come by the bank again a couple of times, as he'd done the week before, just to keep the adulterous twosome off balance, but they were short visits he made to and from other destinations. It worked. By the end of the second week, Carrie was clearly frustrated and anxious. It was assumed Shawn was in the same state of dissatisfaction. Ryan and Consuela congratulated themselves. The pump had been primed.